Is change possible in people? It's a question that's come to mind afresh with the nervousness of the new Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Will it be different this time? Will the same atrocities against women and others be perpetuated again? Growing up in North Dublin, there was a very unfair, harsh saying branded about that went like this, that you can take a man out of Ballymun, but you can't take Ballymun out of the man. Apologies if you're from Ballymun. The prophet Jeremiah rhetorically asked, can a leopard change its spots? And we all perhaps have black sheep in the extended family, or perhaps we're that black sheep, or there's people in the community that get labelled as beyond redemption. Many people get caught in the crossfire. A bad reputation can be very hard to shake. So the question remains, can people change? And if so, how? One of the ways society attempts to bring change is by imposing sanctions on those who don't comply, such as economic penalties for high emission cars or fines for littering if they're caught. These attempts they attempt to engineer changes in human behaviour, yet I would suggest they don't change the heart. Another tool is peer pressure, frequently used. We try and get people to comply with popular opinion, or else they'll be excluded. I would argue that both are inadequate to really change people, as both only lead to superficial change and even resentment underneath. So, is change possible? I have good news and bad news. You see, the good news is that the scriptures not only acknowledge the reality and problem of evil, but also a solution. In fact, the Gospels are littered with individuals whom, upon encountering Jesus, changed as a result. In Paul's letters to the Galatians, there's a list of vices of pagan society that caused immense damage to every aspect of life and community. It's interesting that our Western world has put the pursuit of personal freedom on a pedestal to the neglect, I would suggest, of collective freedom. If everyone selfishly pursues personal freedom as their highest goal, as the highest goal of society, everything is going to unravel before our eyes, and perhaps that's sometimes what is happening. You can easily imagine what is on Paul's list. It's a catalogue of ugly vices, from sexual freedom that might feel good at the time but undermines family and community, idolatry or putting things in the place of God. It's often good things, but and then things that contribute to the breakdown of relationships, such as quarrelling, fits of rage, anger, all these things. And then finally, to the ills and dangers of substance abuse. He just mentions alcohol, but obviously we know there's many more now. There are laws against many of them because they damage us. But maybe you think change is not possible. Maybe you know people, you just think they're never going to change. Perhaps you've watched others attempt to pull up their socks but fail miserably and revert to type. Without God's intervention, that's usually exactly what happens. But the Bible provides a radical solution, and you may remember one of the early videos we unpacked an interview between Jesus and a man called Nicodemus. In it, Jesus promised new birth to those who would come to him, and the promise of the coming of the Spirit that would be like the wind. It would be unseen yet effective. Listen to these desirable virtues of change that can take place in a person's life, according to the Apostle Paul. He says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law." See, there's no law against such things that are beautiful as they develop in people, because they're good and they create better community, better families, better society. But is it mind over matter? Are we just to try harder that some of these qualities might pass on to an individual, to others, or to ourselves? No, you see, trying to make ourselves good by sheer willpower is exhausting. I don't know if you've tried it. It's like being stuck on a treadmill with someone else turning up the dial. What it says is that these are the fruit of the Spirit. So these qualities are the fruit of the Spirit. I'm standing beside an apple tree. You may not have noticed, but the apples are evidence that this is an apple tree. It's not going to produce oranges. It's going to produce apples. And these clusters of fruits that Paul is talking about are evidence of God's Spirit at work. In fact, they are produced as a spontaneous spin-off to the presence of God in people. People who know God are meant to increasingly look like this list. Let me remind you again of that list. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The first three, if you like, seem to be more Godward. Love being the climax of who God is and who we are meant to become. Joy being a quality that God gives irrespective of our circumstances. And the peace of God that passes all understanding. The second cluster of these three affect those around and about us. Patience or long-suffering. Kindness is a disposition. It's a natural flowing that we're kind to those around us. And goodness in all that we say and do. The final cluster appears to focus on self, such as faithfulness, which gives rise to reliability. Obviously affects others too, but it's gentleness, which stems from humility, and self-control over all sorts of things. All good traits. And there's no law against these qualities, because clearly they benefit community and society and family and even ourselves. If you're looking for a marriage partner, who wants someone who's selfish and boastful? If you need an employee, these qualities would be perfect on a CV. What parent doesn't wish their kids were less self-absorbed and more like this list that we have in front of us? I mentioned that the good news is that God can change lives that are placed in His hands. That's precisely why He died and rose again, to forgive people and to transform them by His grace, and give the gift of His Spirit to do what only He can do. You see, God's love is overwhelming, in that when we're at our darkest point, He seeks us and He calls us. His love prompts a heart change with new desires. And that's why this list is powerful, because it's fresh desires that God stirs in our souls, and He begins to bring these to bear as fruit, growing progressively in our lives if we put our lives in His hands. The bad news that I failed to mention, if you like, is that whilst we always want to start with someone else that is wrong in our world, you might think of a neighbour or a friend or someone in your family, God is more interested in you and me. There's a guy called G.K. Chesterton, and he writes this in a newspaper once: "Dear sir, regarding your article about what was wrong with the world, I am," he says, "yours truly." Michael Jackson had a very biblical thought when he wrote Man in the Mirror, because he talks about, if you want to make a change in this world, start with yourself. And that's precisely where God wants to start, with you and with me, one life at a time. Think how differently your family life would look like, your community would look like, if these qualities were to grow in each of us. Think how different our government would be if they put others first ahead of themselves. Ask God today for the gift of His Spirit to transform you. Then perhaps you'll be brave enough to join me in asking God to propagate these amazing qualities in our lives in increasing measure for the benefit of ourselves and everyone around us. God bless you this evening. I'm Matt Tuttleby with Bundoran Bible Reflections in Bundoran Community Garden.